What's the address of your emergency?
Look, my boyfriend is shot.
Are you with him right now?
No, he's outside still shooting. Everybody, I can't go out there. I can't.
There's still shots being fired right now?
What? Get over here. Get over here. Get under the steps.
It started like any other festive evening in the quiet, tree-lined streets of Whispering Oaks. Families gathered for a lively Labor Day barbecue. Music echoed through the neighborhood, and children played on the front lawns.
Yard party that was very loud, went on for hours and hours.
But beneath the surface of all this warmth, a storm was brewing, one that would turn a peaceful Florida suburb into the site of a chilling massacre. Titusville had always been a place people chose to raise their children, a sleepy community where everyone knew each other. But on the night of September 2nd, 2012, that image was shattered forever. Just before midnight, the calm was ripped apart by a hail of gunfire. The neighborhood fell into chaos as the terrifying sound of 31 rounds rang out, piercing the darkness.
When I get pushed, I snap. 31 rounds, two 15-round clips and one in the chamber.
And you ran dry?
Ran dry.
People ran for cover, screams echoed from porches, and confusion set in as loved ones dropped to the ground.
Like I said, Doug, I'm a soldier. I fight to win. This is war to me. I put rounds into his torso until he slumped to the ground. I was on a military mission. I was going to end this war. I can sleep in peace now.
The man behind the gun was William Woodward, a 43-year-old retired Army veteran and longtime resident of the community. He had lived across the street from the victims for years. Their families once shared meals, watched each other's kids, and celebrated holidays together. But over time, something had shifted. A bitter and personal feud had slowly been escalating, and no one had imagined it would end like this.
I need someone here now. My husband's outside bleeding to death.
Okay, you said your husband's outside?
He's laying on the ground with blood all over him.
As police arrived, they were greeted with a scene of absolute horror. Blood stained the pavement, victims lay motionless, and neighbors were left speechless, trying to grasp what had just unfolded.
I am on Smith Drive in reference to a shooting that has just occurred. One white male detained.
3 men had been targeted: Gary Hembry, Roger Pitor, and Bruce Blake.
Yard party that was very loud, went on for hours and hours, was fueled by copious amounts of alcohol.
Each one of them had spent that evening drinking, laughing, and grilling with family, completely unaware that these would be their final moments of normalcy. The attack wasn't random. It was methodical. William Woodward walked across the street with a cold sense of purpose. Armed and dressed like a man ready for combat, he acted with the precision of someone who'd spent years in the military. He didn't just fire, he hunted. One man was gunned down in front of his own child, another was left bleeding in his yard while his wife cried out for help, and a third, though shot nearly a dozen times, would survive against all odds. Woodward didn't run or hide. He waited for police. When officers found him, he was eerily calm, kneeling on the ground as if the battle was over.
This guy is crazy. He's wacko.
Okay.
I'm telling you. I'm scared for my life right now.
Do you know his name?
Officer Albert. Yes, I do. It's William. I know that's who it is.
To him it was. In his mind, he'd fought a war, and he believed he'd won. But the truth was far more complicated. This wasn't just a violent outburst. It was the result of a long-standing conflict that had spiraled into a psychological breaking point. Neighbors who once shared beers on porches had turned into bitter enemies.
You, Billy! Plastic G.I. Joe!
Words had escalated into hate, and hate had become deadly. A tragic collision of mental scars, neighborhood tension, and unchecked rage had turned a soldier into a killer and a community into a crime scene. After the bloodshed in Titusville, investigators sat across from William Woodward, trying to understand what could drive a man to commit such horror in his own neighborhood.
Most of us were familiar with the neighborhood dispute that was going on. Several officers had responded multiple times in the past few weeks to quell verbal disturbances between the neighbors.
What unfolded was not just a confession. It was a haunting glimpse into the unraveling of a man once proud to serve, now drowning in paranoia, rage, and emotional ruin. William Woodward wasn't just a name on a report. He was a former Army soldier who had once worked at the Kennedy Space Center, a man who had stood in deserts under fire, now pacing the quiet streets of Whispering Oaks with a gun at his hip.
He had been working at the Kennedy Space Center where he'd lost his job. He was an Army veteran, and he claimed to be a combat veteran with traumatic brain injury who suffered from PTSD.
To the officers listening, he wasn't hysterical or rambling. He was disturbingly calm, even reflective. He spoke as though his actions had been part of a mission, a final stand in a war only he truly understood.
Ma'am, I apologize for my language, but now I'm getting upset.
You don't have to apologize to me. You're speaking from the heart.
No, I'm getting upset. I'm getting upset again.
Just because we're remembering it?
I'm having flashbacks.
Okay. Well, do me a favor. Take a deep breath. Try to focus on the sound of my voice.
It's very sweet.
Well, thank you. I do try. Just try to stay in the here and now with me as best you can, okay?
What emerged during the conversation was a disturbing timeline, one filled with building resentment, mental health struggles, and a deep belief that he and his family were under siege.
I have no regrets.
Oh, I understand that. I understand that.
I was protecting my family.
I understand that.
Woodward openly claimed he suffered from traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder, intensified by what he described as constant harassment from his neighbors.
I'm a combat veteran with brain damage, and I just snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. They declared war on me, and I'm a soldier, and soldiers fight to win.
He believed the people living just a few feet away were out to destroy him, and that belief had slowly poisoned every hour of his life. It all began with something small, his daughter's birthday present disappearing from their porch.
August 5th.
August 5th. What started August 5th?
Well, August 5th I learned that my daughter's birthday present had been stolen off our front porch by Gary Hembry's daughter, Destiny. Destiny's a little hellion.
He was convinced it was stolen by a neighbor's child, Destiny, the daughter of Gary Hembry. In his mind, this wasn't just a petty theft. It was the spark that reignited his trauma. He didn't trust himself to confront Gary alone, fearing his temper, so he called the police to act as a buffer. But the confrontation didn't calm anything. It lit the fuse.
When I found out that the property had been stolen off my front porch, I called for a police escort because, being a combat stress brain damage veteran, I'm less likely to blow if I have someone as a mediator.
Right.
Gary exploded at the accusation, and from then on, the families became cold and distant.
As soon as they started not talking to each other and not being friends anymore, us kids just stopped playing with each other because of them. Like, they didn't want us to, so we didn't.
The neighborhood kids who once played together now avoided one another, but the feud didn't end at silence. It escalated fast.
Gary and I did have a working friendship for many years.
What changed that?
Him smoking pot in front of the kids. So what we did was we forbid my daughter to go on his property, in his house.
Woodward had chickens in his backyard, which he said helped him cope with his condition. After the birthday present incident, someone reported him to the city, and the chickens were removed.
I just went over the deep end. That happens when I get pushed.
Sure.
I snap. They get drunk, they get stoned, and these
Like you
people
said.
fuck with me and fuck with me and fuck with me and fuck with me and fuck with me.
Listen to me. Listen to me.
To him, that wasn't just petty revenge. It was psychological warfare. Something inside him cracked.
He would tell us that he would kill everybody in the house, including the kids and the animals. He used to walk up and down our street with his dog, with his gun on his hip showing.
The man who once sought peace through therapy animals now stood in his driveway wearing army gear, flipping off his neighbors as they passed. It was more than a gesture. It was a warning.
As a father, you have no idea what that does to a man's mind.
That's correct. I don't. I can imagine.
I can't even tell you. The day she made those threats, I was so enraged. If I could have got my hands on her, I was going to dismember her and disembowel her. I even told her, I'm going to disembowel and eat your guts.
He believed his family was being mocked and verbally abused, targeted because of his status as a disabled veteran. Gary and his friends, including new arrival Roger Pitor, had taken to throwing late-night parties, yelling across the street, and playing loud music that Woodward said triggered his trauma. He began walking with a visible weapon, convinced that everyone around him posed a threat. At one point, he claimed his wife was verbally attacked, with a woman threatening to harm their daughter in horrific ways. That moment, he said, shattered whatever restraint he had left.
Out in the parking lot, it escalates to physical confrontation between Mr. Woodward and Mr. Hembry.
Even the legal system offered no resolution. Both families were dragged into court on August 29, 2012, seeking protection from each other. The judge, seeing little concrete evidence, dismissed both requests and instead gave them a lecture, telling them they were wasting police time. It didn't help. If anything, it poured gasoline on the fire. The hearing ended not in reconciliation, but with fists flying in the courthouse parking lot. By the time Woodward was back in his home, his reality was already slipping. He believed he was at war, not metaphorically, but truly. He saw himself as a soldier on a mission to protect his family, and in that twisted sense of duty, he convinced himself that ending lives was the only way to bring peace. The war in his mind had reached its conclusion. But for Whispering Oaks, the nightmare had just begun. Labor Day weekend was supposed to be a time for rest, for family, for grilling and laughter.
How you like me now?
But in one Florida neighborhood, it turned into something far darker. The moment when years of tension, trauma, and anger exploded into a tragic bloodbath. It had only been 5 days since the courtroom parking lot confrontation, when a brief fight landed William Woodward in jail overnight.
Mr. Woodward and his father out next to Mr. Woodward's truck. You can't hear what they're saying, but you can see Mr. Woodward, Dad, gesturing with his hand.
But the feud hadn't died down. It had only festered. And on that weekend, it reached its terrifying conclusion. The neighbors who had tormented Woodward, Gary, the Blakes, and Roger Pitor, were outside enjoying a loud barbecue party. Alcohol was flowing, and the insults that had long tormented the veteran started again. This time, they were louder, meaner, and more deliberate. According to Woodward, their mocking and shouting even woke him up.
Let me ask you this. Do you remember leaving your house tonight?
Vaguely. I exited the rear garage door. I immediately went into what the military calls a crouching stance.
Okay.
And I used my truck for cover so they couldn't see my movement.
As the verbal abuse escalated, Woodward claimed he saw something on his security footage that sent his thoughts spiraling into panic, a flicker of flame in Gary's hand. He believed it was a Molotov cocktail and feared they were planning to burn his home down.
I low crawled past my truck. I was on my belly. My FS Beretta was on my right hip.
Okay.
My extra clip was in my left pocket. And if you've never been in the military, you wouldn't understand low crawl, but you basically slide your head and face across the ground. And you maintain as low a profile as humanly possible.
By then, his mind was already teetering on the edge. He had often described his situation as a war, not just between neighbors, but inside his own head. That night, with the sound of laughter and insults echoing in his ears, something snapped. Woodward met his father outside. In a quiet exchange, they swapped firearms. What followed was methodical and chilling. He dressed in camouflage, army shirt and pants, and moved as if on a battlefield. Low to the ground, using his truck for cover, he slowly crawled forward.
So what did you do next?
I kept low crawling.
Okay.
I was on a military mission. I was going to end this war.
How long did you sit there and listen to them when they were shouting?
For minutes. I waited for the lights to go out.
Okay.
When you hunt down an enemy, patience is a virtue. If you have no patience, you're not going to make a good soldier.
His mind was locked into a mission, one that wouldn't end with threats or warnings, but with action. In his words, he was a soldier, and soldiers fight to win.
So I waited for the lights to go out. When I got to the I got to the corner of the house is when I charged.
The moment he believed the time was right, he surged forward. The first to fall was Roger Pittior. According to Woodward, Roger's son had been wrestling with him when he approached.
And when I rushed up, Roger's son was on top of him. They were wrestling. Roger's son jumped off his back when he saw me, and I shot Roger in the torso.
The child leapt away as the gunfire began. Next was Bruce Blake, who tried to flee to his garage. Woodward followed and fired repeatedly, leaving Bruce slumped near the doorway. Then came Gary. Hearing the chaos outside, he stepped out to see what was happening and walked straight into a waiting line of fire.
I heard Bruce Blake say something. I followed him to his garage. He tried to go inside the door. I put rounds into his torso until he slumped to the ground.
Woodward fired at his chest and then, with brutal finality, at his head. The violence wasn't over. Woodward returned to Roger to make sure there were no survivors.
He come out of his garage and said, "What the hell's going on out here?" And I had a clean shot at his chest, and I put one dead center of his chest. He slumped to the ground, and I shot Gary Hembry twice in the head, and then I walked back over and saw Roger, and in order to make sure there are no survivors on the battlefield, I point blank shot him in the head once or twice.
He fired again, this time point blank. He had come prepared with 2 full magazines and a round in the chamber, 31 bullets in total, and he used them all. As he walked away from the scene, a stunned neighbor asked if he was okay. Woodward's reply wasn't frantic or shaken. It was calm, eerily so. He had carried out what he believed was justice, but the aftermath would be nothing short of devastating. For William Woodward, it was over.
I was out of bullets.
Okay, so you ran out.
31 rounds.
Okay.
Two 15-round clips and one in the chamber.
And you ran dry.
Ran dry.
The war, as he saw it, had ended. The voices that tormented him, the men he considered a threat to his family, were gone, and in his own words, he could finally sleep in peace.
Good night for you. Got him all. Got him all.
Now the war's over.
Is it?
I promise you, those people will not harass my family or me again. The war is finished. I can sleep in peace now.
In the aftermath of the killings, Woodward never hesitated to paint himself as a soldier, not just by profession, but by purpose. He believed his actions were justified, that he had fought a battle that needed to be fought. To him, it wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but a necessary mission to protect his home from what he saw as enemies. He didn't dwell on how long he'd planned it.
He felt that it was justified, suggesting that this was a war that he had to fight and that this was the enemy. Very much was key.
In his mind, planning wasn't the point. He claimed to live in a constant state of vigilance, always carrying pepper spray, a knife, always watching his back. He had convinced himself that his life was under siege, and the only way to survive was to stay in combat mode 24 hours a day.
Before you left the house tonight,
Oh.
to go do what you did, okay, what you told me that you've done. How long did you sit there and plan it out and think about it? Did you give it much thought?
No.
Okay.
I'm a soldier. I'm prepared to fight 24/7. Especially with them having me amped up all the time. I carry pepper spray, I carry a K-bar.
Throughout the investigation, Woodward insisted he was a disabled veteran, deeply affected by brain damage and PTSD. He spoke of bipolar disorder and the medications he needed to function. His words painted a picture of a broken man, one who had served honorably, gone to war, and returned home only to be harassed and disrespected by civilians who, as he claimed, never wore the uniform themselves. But the reality behind his military record told a different story. Woodward had served in the military, yes, but he had never seen combat. His duties were administrative. While he had been stationed in Iraq, there were no battlefield missions.
So I'm on high alert 24 hours a day. I've honorably served my country. I was honorably discharged. I went to war with brain damage.
Yeah.
I didn't skip the war. I didn't skip out on the war. I went, and I come back, and I'm treated like this by civilians who never even wore the uniform.
The only serious injury he ever reported occurred in Japan, when he fell from scaffolding. That incident affected his hearing in one ear, but there was no record of trauma from combat zones, and certainly nothing close to the war experience he described.
Worked in supply or some administrative position like that, and yes, he was in fact stationed in Iraq. The only brain injury he suffered while he was on active duty in the service was when he was in Japan, and he had fallen off some scaffolding. If you reviewed the records, you'll find that the only residual effect of that injury was he lost hearing in one ear.
The detectives were stunned. Everything Woodward had said about being a combat veteran, about returning from war scarred and mentally fractured, was a carefully constructed illusion.
When was the last time you saw your psychiatrist?
Just last week?
Do you take your meds regularly?
Yeah, I have to, because, like I said, I'm bipolar. I got a serious case of post-traumatic stress disorder, and if I don't take it, my brain damage is severe enough that...
And yet, even after the truth emerged, Woodward didn't change his story. If anything, he doubled down. He claimed that mental illness had taken over, that his thoughts had spiraled beyond his control, and on that night, his mind had finally broken. It was, as he said, the moment he snapped.
I've never been a violent man.
Hmm?
Even when people have pushed me, I've always turned the other cheek, because that's what God says to do. Turn the other cheek. Tonight, my brain broke.
Mm-hmm. Well, like you said, you snapped. I think that's a pretty accurate word.
I fought the war that needed to be fought.
But snapping wasn't enough to spare him the consequences. As prosecutors began preparing for trial, the possibility of the death penalty was raised. The state made an offer: take a plea deal, and the death sentence would be taken off the table. Woodward refused. His defense demanded all charges be dropped and requested his firearm returned, a move that left prosecutors dumbfounded. Then came the legal strategy. Woodward's team filed a motion invoking Florida's controversial Stand Your Ground law, a statute that allows individuals to use deadly force if they reasonably believe their life is in danger.
I told the defense attorney that we would be seeking the death penalty if it went to trial, but that we were willing to take the death penalty off the table and negotiate a plea resolution. His response to me was that the defendant was not interested in any pleas, and the only thing the defendant wanted was that we should drop all the charges and give him his gun back. My reaction was, this is a joke, right?
The defense argued that Woodward acted in self-defense, protecting his family from threats they believed were real. The prosecution was having none of it. In their view, the law didn't apply. Woodward hadn't defended his home. He had left it, crossed a public road, entered another person's property, and opened fire. This, they said, wasn't self-defense. It was execution. As the hearing began, Woodward took the stand, presenting his version of the events.
He left his own property, crossed a public road, went onto the property of the victims, executed them. That is not what Stand Your Ground is.
He spoke about feeling hunted, threatened, pushed to the edge. He claimed he heard what sounded like gunfire before reacting.
They wanted to get me to fight so that they would have a reason for me to go to jail.
How are you feeling at that point?
At that point, pretty doggone scared, because I just heard Roger yell, "Come on out, bitch!" I'm not ready to die at this point. I'm staying in my house.
In his mind, the hostile neighbors were organizing a coordinated attack. To him, it felt like war had been declared on his home, his wife, his children, and he was the only one who could stop it.
Describe to the court what you heard and perceived and what you thought was occurring.
Gather weapons. Come on, let's get up. Let's go do this. Let's end this. It's a gathering of the forces that caused me to snap into action and do what I did.
Is that where you were at that point in time? Were you in war?
You doggone right I was. War had been declared upon my house and family and myself. Now I'm the only living link between my wife and children in imminent death.
He insisted it was not about revenge or harassment. He believed they were going to harm his family, and in his words, they'd have to step over his dead body to do it. But the prosecution knew exactly where to strike. They asked about his military experience, about the combat he claimed to survive.
You weren't just shooting them because they were saying nasty things about you and your family.
No, sir, that's not a reason to shoot anybody.
When you heard the words, "let's end it," or words to that effect, what did you think they were about to do?
Cross the line and do something, bring my life to an end.
He admitted the truth. He'd never seen infantry combat. He acknowledged that the way he killed, shooting wounded victims on the ground, would be classified as a war crime under international law.
Mr. Woodward.
Mr. Woodward. One moment, please. Let me gather them. Sir, this was not a military operation. This was just me observing and placing myself between them and my family with military training to back me up.
The Geneva Conventions forbade such actions. His military persona, the foundation of his defense, crumbled under scrutiny. The judge was clear. The stand-your-ground motion was denied. The trial would move forward. While the defense had managed to raise questions, the prosecution had exposed the illusion for what it was, not a battlefield operation, but a neighborhood massacre fueled by delusion and rage. The real war, it seemed, was inside Woodward's mind, and that war left an entire community shattered.
The defendant also conceded that the way he carried out the executions were in fact a war crime. Did the military train you to stand over the wounded, helpless enemy laying on the ground and shoot them, execute them?
No, sir, they didn't. And yes, you are correct. That is a war crime by the Geneva Convention.
When the courtroom doors opened for William Woodward's trial, the tension that had gripped the community for months finally stepped into the light. The defense centered around one central claim, that Woodward acted in self-defense. But as testimony unfolded, that narrative started to crumble under the weight of disturbing details and conflicting emotions. One of the most crucial voices came from Bruce Blake, the only survivor of Woodward's attack. He described the chaos of the night, his shock as shots rang out without warning, and the realization that he had become a target. His recollection painted a chilling picture, a neighbor suddenly turning into an executioner.
I walked in, got a cigarette, and I come outside and made it almost to my truck. And I heard the first shot, and I looked up, see what, and then I heard two more, and I started feeling them. And then that's when Billy was just standing there shooting me.
Testimony from Woodward's wife, Barbara, added fuel to the storm. She described a toxic environment in the neighborhood, threats, crude language, and escalating hostility. She recounted specific and deeply disturbing remarks made about her children. For her, the atmosphere wasn't just tense. It felt dangerous.
Now, tell me about the threats that were directed towards your children by this gang of people.
Carrie said that she would... Carrie said that she would rip my daughter up the ass. And she...
But her version of events only served to raise more questions about how a neighborhood dispute spiraled into such horror. While there was clear evidence that tensions between the Woodwards and their neighbors had reached disturbing levels,
She said that she would have all the neighbors participate, and that she would burn down my house.
Do you recall whether or not anybody else in this group made any similar comments or threats?
Yes, Roger said.
the trial wasn't about who yelled what insult or which threats were made. The real question was whether those threats justified crossing the street, entering another person's property, and opening fire.
I can still hear their voices screaming at me in the street. And he said, yeah, that's what we're going to do. She said she would pay people if she had to.
Over 7 days, the courtroom became a battleground of arguments. The prosecution painted Woodward not as a desperate father defending his family, but as a man consumed by vengeance. He wasn't reacting to an immediate threat, they argued. He was acting out of rage, determined to deliver his own version of justice.
This didn't have anything to do with self-defense or justification, and it had everything to do with anger, ill will, malice, retribution. He was a vigilante, and he was going to dispense the justice that he thought was appropriate to these people that he considered to be prey.
They acknowledged the toxicity of the neighborhood dynamic, calling it something out of a reality show, but reminded the jury that personal animosity doesn't excuse murder.
What is justifiable use of force? That is the core decision for you to make. If he had intended to go out there with a fully formed, conscious intent to commit murder, you think he wouldn't have had enough foresight to turn off the camera? He believed that the camera was his ally.
They made it clear that self-defense has limits, and that stepping into someone else's yard with a gun and firing wasn't about survival. It was about retribution. On the other side, the defense worked hard to present Woodward as a man pushed to the brink, someone who genuinely believed his family's lives were in danger. They argued that his actions, while extreme, came from a place of fear and trauma. The defense leaned into Woodward's belief that surveillance footage would back him up, suggesting he never meant to hide what he did. But in the end, it was up to the jury to decide. Was this justified force or calculated violence? Their verdict came with clarity. Woodward was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of attempted second-degree murder.
Juror number 104, has the jury reached a verdict as to all 3 counts?
Yes, ma'am. We, the jury, find as follows as to count 1 of the charge. The defendant, William Theodore Woodward, is guilty of second-degree murder, discharge of a firearm causing death. As to count 2 of the charge, guilty of second-degree murder. As to count 3 of the charge, guilty of attempted second-degree murder, discharge of a firearm causing great bodily.
He had originally faced first-degree murder charges, but the jury saw enough complexity to reduce them. Still, the outcome was severe: a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole.
It's a verdict with which I'm totally satisfied, because we knew there was no way that jurors were not going to be, in my mind, as repulsed as I was by the conduct of those victims. But the jury believed what we believed was that it didn't justify homicide.
The trial closed with a powerful message. No matter how toxic or cruel a conflict becomes, it does not give anyone the right to take justice into their own hands, especially when it costs human lives. William Woodward fired 31 rounds across the street, ending lives and shattering families. The court found his actions far from impulsive and sentenced him to life in prison without parole.
The court finds that the defendant armed himself, then crawled across the street and fired 31 bullets at his neighbors. That is not an unsophisticated manner. The court imposes the following sentence: I will adjudicate Mr. Woodward guilty and order him to serve life in prison.
But while justice was delivered in the eyes of the law, the emotional toll remained unbearable for those left behind. Gary's daughter Destiny, already burdened by the absence of her mother, was now forced to grow up without her father.
I wish to present the first person as Destiny Hembry.
It's horrible how much his death has already changed us and is going to change us more. I lost so much that day. I lost everything. I hope, knowing the effect that this has had on me, will help you make the right choice.
The ripple effect of that night at Whispering Oaks was devastating. Families fractured, children left with scars no sentence could ever heal. What was once a close-knit neighborhood had turned into a battleground, leaving only grief and bitterness behind. In just weeks, friendships crumbled into hostility, ending in irreversible loss.
It's really a shame, because at one point, all of the people that we're talking about were friends. In about 1 month's time, they all went from getting along, being good neighbors, to the worst of enemies.
Though the court reached a verdict, the case continues to stir debate. Some feel justice was served. Others still argue about what led up to the tragedy. A warning, perhaps, about how quickly things can spiral when anger goes unchecked. We extend our deepest condolences to the victims' families.